Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making it here today, whether you're watching us live or the recorded version, which we will be sending out. We're happy to have you here and excited to share our brand new series of sailings. PONANT has formed an alliance with Smithsonian Journeys to custom curate 19 itineraries in 2022. You may know Smithsonian Journeys as the travel program for the Smithsonian Institution. And Smithsonian, of course, is one of the most well-respected names in research and education. These remain at the forefront of these 19 programs that we have developed. Today, we're going to talk about two of them, and actually two of our most popular, Antarctica and Iceland. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the faces that you see at the top of the screen. So my name is Lindsay White. I am PONANT's Director of Affinity and Nonprofit Partnerships. But the people that you really want to hear from are the two gentlemen that I have here, Smithsonian Journeys experts and study leaders for the Antarctica and Iceland programs. So first, I have Wayne Ranney. Wayne is a geologist and he will be leading the Antarctica program. He has worked for the U.S. Antarctic Research Program 7, where he was stationed in McMurdo and the South Pole. He must have liked it there because he's been back 29 times to the White Continent since, mainly as a geologic lecturer. Wayne will be talking about rocks, glaciers, and research done in this unique landscape. He usually leads about 3 to 4 Smithsonian Journeys programs each year, but he has also had his hand in designing a program in the Southwest US for Smithsonian. I've had the pleasure of traveling with Wayne in the past, and he really has a knack of bringing the destination to life. So I'm excited for you all to hear a little bit from Wayne today about what Antarctica is like for him. Next, we have equally as impressive Smithsonian Journeys expert, Jim Zimbelman. So Jim is a senior geologist emeritus at Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He is also the chairman for the Center of Earth and Planetary Studies. Jim has written 3 books, including Volcanoes of Mars, and he has over 110 journals and map publications for peer-reviewed scientific research. His background is numerous. It includes physics, math, space physics, and then geophysics, as well as geology. And he also has been on many Smithsonian Journeys programs, including 5 to Iceland and 2 NASA-supported research programs to Iceland. So before I give them the reins, I wanted to briefly touch on how these programs are different from our classic PONANT itineraries. So we have 3 main differences. Our Smithsonian Journeys Alliance programs will have 2 Smithsonian Journeys experts on each departure. All of the ports will include a guided excursion, and we'll also be including arrival and departure transfers on the group arrival and departure days. So I talked about the 2 Smithsonian Journeys experts. I've already introduced Wayne as the study leader for Antarctica, but I definitely wanted to also introduce Michelle Thaler. Dr. Thaler is an astrophysicist. She has over 2 decades of science communication experience, and her research involves the life cycle of stars. She's worked in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the Goddard Flight Space Center. Dr. Thaler has given 2 TEDx talks and that really focus on astronomy, and she also has hosted the podcast Orbital Path on public radio. If you get a chance, check out Dr. Thaler's TEDx talks on YouTube. I've seen them and they are absolutely incredible and worth your time. So going on to the next slide, I'll go ahead and let Wayne take the reins and talk about Antarctica.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay, and good morning and good afternoon to those of you that are out there listening to this. It's my extreme pleasure this morning to share with you both my experience with Smithsonian Journeys and also with PONANT, as I have traveled with both in the past before to Antarctica. Um, as Lindsay mentioned, I've been to Antarctica 29 times. I can't get enough of the white continent, even though I am not necessarily a person who likes the cold. I think if you sign up for this journey, what you will find is that a summer in Antarctica is much more temperate than a winter in many places in the United States or Canada. So on this slide right here, we can see the map of the general area on the globe where we will be. The trip will come into Buenos Aires, and then we go to the southernmost city, Ushuaia, and you can see that the journey there across the Drake Passage leads us to the Antarctic Peninsula. And the Antarctic Peninsula we sometimes refer to as the banana belt in Antarctica because it is the part of the continent that is the farthest north. It is a maritime climate, so it's relatively mild climate that we experience there. We'll go to the next slide, please. And that will be just a view of a photograph I took in Buenos Aires. And of course, this is where the group will assemble on the Antarctic voyages. And Buenos Aires is sometimes called the Paris of the South. And there are many, many immigrants that have come to Argentina from Europe. And so it has one of the largest Italian populations outside of Italy, a large contingent of Germans and other Europeans. And back at the beginning of the 20th century, this classic architectural style was started in Buenos Aires. And it's just one of the most pleasant large cities I've ever been to in the world. This photograph was taken on the Plaza de Mayo. And over there on the far right is the National Cathedral, where our current Pope had his diocese when he was in Argentina. Now, the trip is going to be going and staying in the Hilton Hotel in Buenos Aires, and the Hilton is located in the Puerto Madero district. And this is an old warehouse area where all the cargo would come into Argentina in the early and middle parts of the 20th century. It was abandoned for a more modern port sometime around the 1970s. And since that time, it has been repurposed as an upscale and very interesting part of the city right on the waterfront of the Rio de la Plata. On this particular voyage, folks will have the opportunity to sign up for a 2-day pre-extension in which you can spend 2 full days and 2 extra nights in Buenos Aires. And if you are able to do that, I can highly recommend it, as this city has a lot to offer the traveler. So we will take a 4-hour domestic flight from Buenos Aires, and we will fly to Earth's southernmost city. And this is located on the island of Tierra del Fuego. And you can see from this view, looking at the Beagle Channel there along the shores of Tierra del Fuego, that this is a spectacular landscape that would be deserving of a visit, even if you weren't going to Antarctica. You can see a very large ship in the harbor there. That is not the PONANT ship, but the dock in Ushuaia has had to be extended 2 or 3 times since I first started making these voyages to Antarctica in the early 1990s, because of the rise of popularity of people going to Antarctica. We get to start out and sail for about 30 miles on the Beagle Channel, which is where Darwin spent a lot of time on his famous voyage around the world in the 1830s. And on these Smithsonian Journey trips, I give a lecture about the Native Americans that inhabited Tierra del Fuego, some of the most interesting groups of Native Americans that we've ever encountered, people who lived along the shores of the Beagle Channel and essentially wore no clothes, but they could survive in this type of environment. Tierra del Fuego is the second largest island in South America, the other one being at the mouth of the Amazon River. And it's a beautiful landscape. And I hope all of you will get a chance to one day come with Smithsonian Journeys on the Patagonia Explorer that we also offer through Smithsonian Journeys. Now, a lot of rumor and innuendo is implied about the crossing of the Drake Passage, and I'm sure there's some of you that are listening this morning that are thinking, I really want to go to Antarctica, but I've heard horror stories about the Drake Passage. Let me assure you, I've made this crossing 52 times on various vessels throughout my many years of career of sailing down to Antarctica. And at least 50% of the time, we call it the Drake Lake. And that's because there is no wind blowing. And so you have about a 50-50 chance that the sailing will be as smooth as if you were on a northeastern lake. Admittedly, about a quarter of the time, the voyage is rough, and another quarter of the time, it sometimes gets very rough. But in the trips that I have done with the PONANT vessels, their stabilizers can take those rare rough moments very, very well. And I can assure you that the reward at the end of that is much more than the risk that you would have of sailing across the Drake Passage. So let me just say, this should not be a deal breaker for anybody wanting to go to Antarctica. It is oftentimes very, very smooth. And of course, once you arrive in Antarctica, then the reward begins. And let me also state that when you're in the Antarctic Peninsula, you will be sailing on protected waters. And we never have rough seas once we arrive in Antarctica. And look at this view that you get to see, a completely glaciated landscape unlike any other on the whole planet Earth. This particular view is from a place called Charlotte Bay, which we like to visit. And oftentimes you can get these clear, sunny days in Antarctica. It's a photographer and artist's dream to sail through this other world landscape. Antarctica is a continent of science, and in 1959, 13 signatory countries signed a treaty that said that Antarctica would be a continent for science and peace. And the Antarctic Treaty, now ratified by over 70 countries in the world, states that there will be no military activities. An amendment in 1991 said there will be no mineral exploration. And what you see in the photograph here is a scientific research station. And in the Antarctic Peninsula, 25 stations are located at various places. And the reason so many countries have these scientific stations in the peninsula is because, as I said at the beginning, this is the banana belt. I have seen the temperature 49 degrees on some landings when we come here to Antarctica. And it's true that most first-time visitors, when they go ashore for the first time, work up a healthy sweat from wearing too many clothes going ashore. This is a view of a place called Paradise Bay, which coincidentally is also where we can have a great chance to encounter in a very close manner humpback whales and all kinds of other wildlife. PONANT and Smithsonian are offering some spectacular activities while you're in Antarctica. And one of the most time-honored traditions on these voyages is having a Zodiac cruise, where you do not actually step on shore anywhere, but you just cruise around icebergs or cruise around the shoreline looking for wildlife, looking at historic camps. And a Zodiac cruise is really one of the highlights of going to Antarctica. Of course, we will always make stops and go ashore in those places where it's safe to go. 99.9% of the time, these are ice-free areas. We have to make our landings where there is no ice or snow. And another thing that's being offered are these kayak trips. And kayaking amongst the icebergs is really an unforgettable experience. This is an activity that does have an additional cost and must be pre-booked, but it is nonetheless something that, if you're able to, a wonderful thing to experience and look down into these icy waters and see perhaps a seal or penguins swimming beneath you. A lot of people want to go to Antarctica to experience the wildlife that is present down there, and probably the most iconic of these wildlife species would be the penguin. And we will definitely see 3 species of penguins. This is the Adelie penguin, a very gentle penguin. The penguins stand about 2.5 feet tall. They sometimes nest in these giant rookeries. And occasionally we will go ashore in a rookery that may contain 20,000 pairs of penguins, whether they be Adelies or Gentoos or chinstraps. And of course, that means there's 40,000 penguins. And the penguins will often lay 2 eggs. And so after those eggs hatch, you can visit a rookery where maybe you'll see 80,000 penguins squawking on shore. This is a picture of the Gentoo penguin, probably people's most favorite penguin to see. They have a very gentle sound that they make. And we learn a lot about the life cycle of the penguins. One of the parents will go out to sea for 36 hours, feed in the ocean on the ocean krill that is there, come back to the nest and regurgitate that food to their chicks, and then the other parent will go out for a similar 36 hours. The other types of wildlife that we're very, very likely to see are different species of whales, different species of seals, and many, many different flying birds that come to the Antarctic in the Antarctic summer. My specialty, of course, will be sharing with you some interest in the landscape. And believe me, there is nothing like you've ever seen like the Antarctic landscape. Even if it was not covered in ice, this would still be a landscape that would hold interest to all kinds of lovers of nature, photographers, and artists. And this is a particular scene as we're sailing up into the Le Maire Channel. One of the highlights of the trip is to do this 7-mile transit between the Antarctic continent on the left and Booth Island on the right. And it can be a narrow passage, but it's plenty deep as it's carved out by glaciers that have now receded back from this area. And it's just a spectacular experience to see the landscape of Antarctica. We will also sail into a giant caldera on Deception Island. Deception Island is a volcano that exists in the South Shetland Islands. That's considered part of the Antarctic Peninsula region. And this particular photograph that I took is inside the flooded center of this volcanic caldera. And it was on the shores of Port Foster, where the Norwegians had a whaling station back at the turn of the 20th century, and the British established a scientific base in the 1940s. And in 1967, Deception Island roared back to life, had a volcanic eruption, and has left the ruins of these particular settlements in the shores of Deception Island. It's a fantastic landscape to go ashore in, and here we have the chance to experience Antarctic history and volcanic geology as it's present in the Antarctic Peninsula. People sometimes ask me, Wayne, why do you come back to Antarctica 29 times? And really, the best answer that I can give for that is because of the icebergs. The icebergs that float out to sea here are of all different sizes, all different shapes, and doing a Zodiac cruise around the icebergs and seeing these icebergs floating in the water is really a fantastic experience. And you can see in the inset photograph there just one of the interesting shapes that these these icebergs can take. And here you see one of our Zodiac cruises going beneath a giant iceberg. And just very quickly, geologically, as you look at this tall iceberg in the water, what you see in the lower half are these vertical crevices that are in the ice. This is where the glacier was sitting 90 degrees different than you see in the photograph on land, accumulating snow through season after season after season. It broke off from the continent, floated out to sea, rotated its orientation into vertical, and it's been floating in the water long enough that snow has been falling on it through various Antarctic winters to give you the texture of the ice in the upper half. There's so much to learn when we go to Antarctica, and I hope that you will join us on this voyage that we have with Smithsonian Journeys. And at this time, I'd like to turn the lecture over to my colleague, Jim Zimbelman, who will now talk to you about Iceland.
Yes, and before we hand it over to Jim, I wanted to tell everyone to feel free in your chat box on the right of your screen to put any questions that you have for Wayne about Antarctica, or myself with PONANT and the Smithsonian Journeys Alliance. We'd be happy to answer them, and Jim would as well at the end of this presentation. I also wanted to point out that right now we have a couple of staterooms for the Antarctica program where we do not have a single supplement fee. So now is a great time to think about booking. If you're like me, after hearing Wayne's presentation, I'm ready to go. So without further ado, I wanted to get into Iceland. Again, the second Smithsonian Journeys expert for Iceland on the June departure will be Elizabeth Ward. And Elizabeth also has a great Smithsonian connection. She was previously assistant curator of the Smithsonian exhibit Vikings, the North Atlantic Saga. She since has learned Scandinavian and Icelandic, and she's gotten a PhD in languages and literature. She's very passionate about Iceland and actually lived there from 2006 to 2010. She received Icelandic citizenship and has appeared on documentaries for the Smithsonian Channel and others. She worked as a program director for the Vikingheimer Museum in Iceland as well, and she will be the second study leader. And now I will pass the baton to you, Jim.
Thank you. And I did not know all of that background about Elizabeth until just now, so I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say as well. Well, I have really fallen in love with Iceland, and I'm very much looking forward to the trip. The little map there gives you a good idea of what we will be seeing on the trip, and you will be hitting the real highlights of the country, and particularly on the last day. That first bullet point about Golden Circle is some of the highest priority tourist things we'll be doing in our last stop. But I'm looking forward to several of our stops because they are to places that I have not been before. My previous Smithsonian Journeys trips have been land tours, and I have not been to either Grimsey or Jaime Islands, nor the northwestern fjord country. So those are going to be particular highlights for me. But before we start into the actual trip itself, I'll just remind you I'm a geologist, so that's what took me to Iceland in the first place. This is the only place in the world where you can stand on a mid-oceanic ridge, and that ridge runs right through the middle of Iceland. On one of the Golden Circle stops, we will be able to be seeing two different plate boundaries. What do I mean by plate? The crust of the Earth is broken up into several, the number varies, but on the order of 12 to 15 portions of the crust that are moving independently, and they form along ridges. Well, here at Iceland, you can actually see those dynamics of what the Earth is doing without it being in a submersible. And that was what took me to Iceland in the first place, just to see the geology. But once there, the people and particularly the history I've just fallen in love with both of those. That it's a very warm group of people that live on Iceland. They're very proud of their nation and love to share about it, and they have such an incredible history. And I am anticipating that Elizabeth will be able to fill in much more about that history than I could as a geologist. So as we talk about the itinerary, just remember I'm giving you more of a geologist perspective, but at the same time, you're going to be hearing from Elizabeth about some of the fascinating aspects of the Icelandic culture. So next, let's start on day one, and that will be in the capital city of Reykjavik. And as is true of most of the European capitals, the capital has almost a third of the population of the entire country. Well, this city is worthy of exploration in and of itself, just as Wayne mentioned about Ushuaia. And I'm not exactly sure how much free time there will be for you to explore, but you can do plenty on your own. This is a picture I took on one of my early trips to Iceland, because I still remember on my first trip on Icelandic Air flying into Reykjavik, on the little napkin that accompanied the peanuts was this phrase that said the most popular restaurant in Iceland is a hot dog stand. And I said to myself, you've got to be kidding. Well, when we got on shore and the guides started talking, sure enough, that little stand where the line is queuing up, the red banner is the top of it. I mean, the entire stand is smaller than a typical room in a home. And yet the Icelanders love it. And I have grown to really enjoy it too. The little inset is one of the hot dogs. And I'm not a mustard person, but I turned out to really enjoy this Icelandic homemade mustard that they put on their hot dogs. Next to it is a bottle I didn't buy at the stand, but in a nearby grocery store. It is titled Egil's Appelsin. Well, Egil is one of the primary Viking heroes of the sagas. And I'm sure Elizabeth will give us much more background about the sagas, but Egil is a particularly colorful character. This brand just borrows his name, and Appelsin, even though it has apple, it is actually orange juice. So this was an orange soda, just available in most places. The hot dog stand only had sort of Coke and Pepsi, and I wanted the Icelandic orange juice, which is very good, again, an orange soda. And before we leave this slide, I'll point out one other thing. There's that green little hill in the background. That's kind of a park that is right in between the bulk of the city of Reykjavik and the port area where the ship will be docked. And on my last trip to Iceland, it happened to be during the Euro Cup, the soccer match. And on that day, Iceland was playing England. And I remember I was packing to get ready to leave the next day. The Icelanders were ahead, and this was just an enormous shock. Well, that continued through the entire game, and I began to hear this roar outside. Well, that green hill was completely covered in fans cheering and following things on large monitors they had. Iceland won that game, beat England, a very heavy favorite. And it's estimated that a quarter of the population of Iceland was on that hill during that game. That's one of my more memorable aspects of visiting Reykjavik. Fascinating city. Next, please. So once we have completed our time in Reykjavik and we'll begin cruising around the island, one of the first things we'll pass is a peninsula that has this very lovely volcano called Snapeljokel. Now, I won't try and teach you Icelandic, but there are just a couple of words that may help you as you're looking at the itinerary. The last part of that name, Jökull, is Icelandic for ice. So Snæfellsnes is the snow-covered or ice-covered hill that happens to be a volcano. Well, this volcano has a pretty interesting history. Any of you who are fans of Jules Verne are probably familiar with the story Journey to the Center of the Earth. Well, in that remarkable story, the explorers begin their journey beneath the surface of the Earth through this volcano. Curious that Verne chose that as the starting point for his exploration. Now, this picture is slightly older than current because, unfortunately, climate change is having a significant effect on Iceland and, in fact, all of the polar regions. And it's pretty difficult to get a good snow cover that covers the entire volcano, like you're seeing here. That is currently. And in fact, in the not too distant future, it's quite possible the Icelanders may have to take Jökull off of the name of the feature because the ice fields are diminishing constantly. That is just clear evidence. I think Wayne and I will both be supportive of saying that the poles are the most dramatic place on the planet where you can see evidence of climate change happening. That is definitely true in Iceland, and this is a good illustration of that. Next, please. on that same peninsula, we'll also be looking at some of the coastline, very rugged. Unlike the pictures Rain showed you of Antarctica, Iceland has ice. You know, don't let the name put you off. It has ice, but it doesn't cover the majority of the nation by any means. Lovely geology. That's part of what attracted me to it. Another geologic tidbit is, if you were on the trip with me and Elizabeth, you can become an amateur geologist by simply saying there is a basalt or there is a volcanic rock. Doesn't matter what you're looking at. 95% of the rocks on Iceland are volcanic. So right from the time you land, you will be able to be sounding authoritative in your geology. Well, that's just a good illustration of the dramatic cliff faces. And at the places we will be visiting and stopping at, I'll give you more specifics about the local geologic history, but just realize it's virtually all going to be volcanic in origin. Now, this particular peninsula is close to another place called Arnarstapi, which is a small fishing village that hopefully our visit will include it, because it is so small you can see it very quickly, but it's a good typical view of a modern, still functioning fishing village in Iceland. Next, please. Okay, day 3, we have cruised around the northwestern end of the country, and we will be coming back to that on our return, but we're heading towards Grimsey. This is an island and is part of Iceland itself, but it's not part of the main island. This is the place, the only place in Iceland that reaches the Arctic Circle. So when we are on shore, we will have the opportunity to walk to the northern end of Grimsey and have walked across the Arctic Circle. That ought to be worth the adventure, just to be able to say that. But at least the trip I'm involved in June is also a great time for nesting birds. And in this case, you'll have puffins hopefully feeding their chicks in their nests as we are walking along Grimsey. A setting unlike many of the other places in Iceland, because it's completely offshore from the main island itself, and the wildlife love it there. Next. All right, another part of our visit while we are staying in this part of Iceland is going to Lake Mivottan. Vatn, that word is Icelandic for lake. And so Lake Mivottan, we're actually saying lake twice, but the MY part of the name refers to a small midge, a little fly. And I believe in mid-June is not the peak time for these things. They are very small, but they can be very pesky while you're out there walking on the trail. But that's why the name Mivottan, where it comes from, rather. Well, the landform in the center of the picture that I took here is the type example to geologists all over the planet of something called a pseudocrater. And what is that? I won't go into great detail here, but if a hot lava flow flows across either a lake or wet sediments, the water beneath it flashes into steam and causes an explosion. That is what happened at this crater. And this is only one of a whole field of them at this particular stop. I was very pleased to get here on one of my early trips, because this location is one of the best places to see features that we are now finding on Mars. I should have mentioned that while I am a terrestrial geologist interested in the geology of Earth, my research has mostly been on planetary volcanism, Mars in particular. And our latest terrific camera to be in orbit around Mars has shown many features that are just like these cones that we are seeing here at Lake Mivottan. So on the trip, this is one of the spots that you will have the chance to get a view of what Mars might be like while we are exploring and seeing Iceland for its own fascinating aspects. Next, please. All right, still the same day, so we will be driving around to multiple stops. Dimmaborger is another place where a lava flow has interacted with wet ground, but this time instead of explosively, it has just cooled the lava into these sort of chimneys. That's what these spires are in the center of the picture. So it's just another aspect of how common volcanism interacts with the water and the ice that is present just about everywhere on the country. Well, Dimmaborger is also a place of interest for local folklore. In particular, something called the Yule Lads are supposed to have their home in this sort of fascinating landscape of Dimmaborger. And what are the Yule Lads? Well, it's sort of evolved over the years, but they are 13 brothers that come out around Christmas time and visit Icelandic homes around the nation. Not like Santa Claus. Each of the 13 have unique interests, and one wants to eat skyr, which is Icelandic yogurt. One will steal fish. One will lick spoons. I mean, it's just a fascinating way that the Icelandic culture has been wrapped up into these 13 Yule Lads that come out of Dimmaborger around Christmas time. Next slide. All right, again, still day 4. We will also be stopping at Gdafoss, one of the beautiful falls of Iceland. There are many of them. Foss means falls. Gda, in this case, stands for gods. And this place, again, has relevance to sort of the history of Iceland. Iceland has the longest steadily meeting parliament in the world. It started around AD 970, and we will visit the place where that was held in those early days. Well, in around AD 1000, the Icelanders at this parliamentary meeting voted to become Christian. I find that sort of fascinating that it was a vote of the entire nation, and the majority said they were ready to turn Christian. So once that vote was taken, the people threw their gods, their little statues and whatnot, into these falls, and that's where that name comes from. So Iceland has been a Christian nation since AD 1000 by vote. Next slide. Here we're going to get to one of the things that I'm particularly looking forward to, because the Fjordlands in the northwest corner of the country is a part of Iceland that I have not been able to visit before, in part because the roads are fairly limited here, and the ships like PONANT uses is a great way not only to get to some of the villages and cities. There aren't very many large cities, but villages scattered around there, and give us access to places like this Fisherman's Hut. It shows a pretty typical view of how the Icelanders have adapted to their environment. They have sort of a rocky walled base, the lower half of their homes, but then a wooden structure over which there is a sod roof, which is very practical. The Icelanders are extremely practical people, and this sort of architecture is a good example of that. We will see other examples of this throughout Iceland. Again, just as Wayne mentioned for Antarctica, you can see the backdrop in many of these pictures. The landscape, particularly in this northwestern Fjordlands, is a lot like Norway, so that glaciers over untold numbers of cycles of ice moving down the valley and then maybe retreating have carved these deep water flooded glacially carved valleys. That's what a fjord is. Well, Iceland has many of them, and in this northwest corner of the nation is one of the highest concentrations of such fjords. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that both from the land and from the ship. Next. Okay, day 6. Now, once we leave that northwestern Fjordlands, we'll cruise past Reykjavik and down to the southern side of the country to the island of Jaime, yet another place I have not yet been able to visit during my visits to Iceland. This is an entirely volcanic island, and that plays into the history. Well, on Jaime, we'll have two options for what to do, and one is represented by the little inset there. You'll be able to visit an aquarium that has two beluga whales, which are the white whales. So if you are into unique animals, this is a great chance for you to get up close to a very special kind of whale. I'm obviously going to be going on the other option, which is to see the volcanic aspects on Jaime. The picture is a good indication of how the town is sort of built in and around the volcanic aspects of the island. Well, that history came to life for the Icelanders not that long ago. I believe it was 1986, if I'm remembering right, is when a volcanic eruption started right at the mouth of the harbor of Jaime. And there was great concern for quite some time, would the volcano close off the harbor? That would have been an enormous catastrophe for the entire population of the island, which are all fishermen. Well, through heroic aspects of the Icelanders themselves and through nature taking its course and not actually completely blocking the harbor itself, the eruption did not block the harbor. It did damage many homes in Jaime, and those are preserved now, in fact, and that should be part of this tour where we'll see some of the homes that were affected by the lava flow coming from the volcano that was threatening to block the port of Jaime. Next, please. And on our 7th day at Iceland, we will be back to Reykjavik and from there go on what is called the Golden Circle. So this is the 3 real tourist highlights of Iceland we'll be seeing on that last day. And we'll start at Thingvellir. And this is the location of that parliament that I was talking to you earlier about. The little white buildings there are where the president of Iceland would stay during the summer months, and sort of it's the home, the White House, away from the location in Reykjavik, close to Parliament. Now you can, surprisingly, I mean, the security is a little different in Iceland than we're used to in the US. You can walk right up to the buildings and peek into the windows, unless the president happens to be there, and then I'm sure the security would be a little different. Well, the center of the picture, you can hopefully see this small bridge that is crossing this crevasse or crack that is part of the landscape there. The left part of the frame is a cliff face that the Icelanders realized had incredibly good natural acoustics. A person speaking, standing at the base of this cliff, could be heard by literally thousands of people surrounding him. So that is the location of this Icelandic parliament. They call it the Althing. All being, there were smaller parliaments held in cities, but the Althing was the national parliament held once a year, where they did all of their legal business for the year along this cliff face. So I took this picture standing on the North American plate, so the very edge of the portion of the crust that is carrying all of North America with it, and looking to the right side of the frame, the rift here is about 3 kilometers, about 2 miles wide. On the right side, you're looking at the European plate. And again, this is one of the few places on the planet where you can be above water and seeing how these spreading centers that are the mid-oceanic ridges that cover tens of thousands of miles on the seafloor of the oceans around the Earth, this is a great place to be able to see it. And as we have been hearing all along, the Icelanders incorporate what they can use in their amazing landscapes around them into what they need to achieve, including acoustics before anyone had even come up with that word. Next slide. Next stop is another foss, Gdafoss, the Golden Falls, and that name comes from just the interesting lighting that it can get late in the afternoon. This picture was not quite late in the afternoon, but the mist from the falls itself allowed us to get a great rainbow over the falls while we were visiting. What's happening here is the river called Vita is falling down two different sort of steps, height difference of about 96 feet, and that is what is creating Gdafoss. Now, in mid-June, we're going to be there when the days are the longest, and that's obviously a great time to be able to see these things. But one of my hopes for an eventual trip to Iceland is to be to Gdafoss in the middle of winter. They do the same Golden Circle tour in wintertime because these falls completely freeze. Now the water is still flowing, but the upper surface of the falls is completely frozen over, and there are ice climbers climbing up a waterfall. That would be worth seeing. We aren't going to see it in June, but this is the location where many Icelanders do ice climbing during the winter. Next. And the third stop of this Golden Circle tour is at a geyser field. And here the Icelanders have labeled this particular feature as geyser with an I. Well, in fact, that name gives its name to geysers throughout the world. Geysa, as you see maybe at the lower left there, is Icelandic for, oh, maybe it was cut off, gushing forth. A pretty logical way to describe these things. So this feature was still active at the time that the Icelanders first inhabited the land and up until the early 1900s. It has since stopped erupting. There's still a little steam coming out of it, but all geysers in the world are named after this one feature. Only a few hundred steps away from geyser is Stroker, and that's where the little inset is a selfie of me with Stroker erupting behind me. About every 5 minutes or so, it spews forth a nice flow of hot water. Now, it isn't as tall as, say, Old Faithful in here in the US might be, but Stroker does this about every 5 minutes. So you don't have to be there very long to be able to see multiple examples of a geyser in action, as well as being next to the one that has named these features across the planet. And it wasn't the Icelanders that did that, by the way. That was geologists who realized that geysers were first well documented by the Icelanders in this area. So I think that's my last slide. Let's go forward and see if that's the case. Yep. Here's some recommended reading, and I'll just give you a little bit of information about the 4 books that I suggested for Iceland. The first one, Independent People, is by Halldór Laxness. Laxness won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1955. So an exceptionally excellent writer. Independent People is perhaps the best view you will get of early Icelandic farming in, say, the turn of the 1900s Iceland. A remarkable account, and it not only tells you the difficulties the Icelandic farmers had, but just where some of the culture, the can-do spirit of the Icelanders comes from. Sagas is just a nice collection of Icelandic sagas, and it includes the complete Egil saga. Yule Lads is a wonderful little book. I don't know if you can see this, but these are the pictures in that little booklet of some of the Yule lads. It's kind of intended for kids, but I thoroughly enjoyed the stories that are recorded there as well. And the final book, if you're really into geology, this is a field guide that goes into extreme detail on the geology. I'm still reading it right now. I only got it last year during COVID. But if you want details about that country, that's a good place to get it. So with that, I'll turn it back to Lindsay for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jim. So wanted to also let you know that this will be recorded and we will send you an email with the recording. You can also find the recording on the PONANT USA Facebook page. May not be today, but over the next couple of days, we will have that posted. I'm also excited to tell you that we're offering a $250 onboard stateroom credit for any reservations made on these two programs for people that have watched this webinar. So at the time of making the reservation, simply mention this webinar and the credit, and that is valid for any reservations by July 30th. And then moving on, I wanted to let you know that if you enjoyed this webinar, our next series is headed to warmer climates. We're going to talk about the Panama and Costa Rica by Sea program. And then our second one is cruising the Caribbean's Windward Islands. We've got two more amazing Smithsonian Journeys experts lined up, and we'd love to have you attend. So now on to the questions. We have gotten some really great ones. I think we've answered a couple of them already in the presentation. So Maria asks, thank you for your presentation, Wayne. How would you describe the highlights of the various summer months? What would be the best month to see penguin chicks in Antarctica? And what months are whales most active?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I think the highlights of the Antarctic summer are watching the midnight sun. And sailing on these ships to Antarctica, you have to remind yourself to go to bed, because after you finish a scrumptious meal on the Ponant, what happens is that it's still light out. It's almost as if the sun is still 2 hours away from setting, and you look at your watch and it's 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And of course, the ship is always underway somewhere, and it's moving across the Antarctic landscape. And I always tell people, for the 5 days that you're in Antarctica, don't expect to sleep except when you can catch a cat nap, and you can sleep when the trip is over. The best time to see the whales, I think, was part of the question, and that is any time from the beginning of December until they leave at the end of February. And I think the best time to see the penguin chicks would be between Christmas and the end of January. And that's when the chicks are out from underneath their parents, and you can actually go to the rookeries and you can see them as tiny birds. If you go before January, the chicks are sitting under their parents' pouch, or they're actually in eggs. And then if you go after the end of January, they're already getting ready to leave, and they have to grow up at that time. I would say that sailing in the midnight sun is really one of the things that is a highlight.
Excellent.
If I can add, I should have said that mid-June is close to the same kind of lighting that Wayne is talking about for Iceland. Yeah. And in fact, when we are at Grimsey at the Arctic Circle, we will do that within a week of solstice, which means it's quite likely the sun will just kiss the horizon. 24 hours of sunlight on that side of the island.
That's great. And actually, Jim, that kind of leads to a question that I just got about Iceland. And it is, where will we see whales and other ocean wildlife on the Iceland itinerary?
Almost certainly. Now, I can't tell you what part of Iceland has the highest concentration, except I know that the larger cities like Reykjavik, Akureyri, they all run whale watching tours. You don't have to go far offshore to see them. Well, that's where the PONANT ship's going to be going too. So the odds are very good. We're going to just see them, not continuously, but very often as we are cruising to our different ports of destination.
Great. And we just got a question asking if lectures will be in English. And since Jim and Wayne will be giving the lectures, they will definitely be in English.
Yep.
These programs will only be in English. So I guess that's another difference between our classic PONANT and the Smithsonian Journeys programs. Our classic PONANT programs are in French and in English, and the Smithsonian Journeys Alliance programs will be only in English, including all of the lectures.
And even though it's a French company, I will say the naturalists are all exceptionally good in English. Absolutely no problems communicating with any of them.
That's great. Thanks for that, Jim. So another question from Rhonda is, how much time ashore do you get on the Antarctic voyage? My husband and I are both wildlife photographers, and we're interested in sailing with the most time ashore. Also, how many people per Zodiac? So I can answer the Zodiac question. We have about 10 people on each Zodiac, and I'll let Wayne speak to the time ashore.
Yeah, that's right. We do put about 10 people per Zodiac, and the PONANT ships take a maximum of 199 people. And by provisions of Antarctic Protocol, only 100 passengers can be ashore at any one time. So when we make a stop, we will have Group A go ashore first. And while they're ashore for maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours, there will be a lecture by the other Smithsonian professor that's along, and Group B will hear the lecture. Then they switch sides, and Group A will come back and hear the lecture or watch the Antarctic landscape from the upper deck, and Group B will go ashore to photograph. There are not huge areas that you can wander around in because we never go onto the glacial ice. And so there's not a great deal of places you can go. So an hour and a half or 2 hours ashore is plenty of time for photographers and even painters and sketchers to get their chosen field of art well accomplished while they're ashore.
That's great. And then we also do usually have 2 landings per day where possible. So we'll do one before lunch and one after lunch as well.
That's correct.
Okay. So Linda asks, you mentioned, Wayne, that on the Zodiac cruises in Antarctica, you don't step ashore, but you also said that the Zodiacs go ashore. Is that correct?
Yes, our fleet of Zodiacs, they are all-purpose uses that we have there. So they are used for cruises in those places where a Zodiac cruise only is scheduled. We also use the very same Zodiacs to step ashore, and they serve both purposes. But I guess it is possible, and we have done this in the past, that sometimes while a group is ashore, there may be a Zodiac cruise for Group B, and both groups are actually doing an activity while we're there. So one of the things I like about traveling with PONANT, and I have traveled with many travel companies, but going with PONANT, especially with Smithsonian, we always keep you busy trying to get you to see Antarctica or Iceland. Like Jim, I've been with Smithsonian to Iceland many times, and I truly enjoy it. You will not get bored on this trip, believe me.
That's great. And you're right, Wayne. We often will have one group ashore, and then we will do the Zodiac cruise for the rest of the travelers. So you will have ample time to see the wildlife from your Zodiac or on land as well. And we have a question from Fran to Wayne. How has the ice, snowpack, and landscape changed since you began visiting Antarctica?
So I first went to Antarctica in 1986, just to give you a sense for my visual record of Antarctica. And visually, there is no retreat of the ice that is really all that visible. However, biological sciences have informed us that penguin populations are actually migrating from thousand-year-long rookeries, keeping up with how their food resources are moving. I know of one scientific couple who's been studying a penguin rookery in the peninsula for over 35 years, and some rookeries have been abandoned in the last 5 years, and all of those penguin populations have moved to the south following their resources. And this is an indication that as Antarctic waters begin to warm slightly, these food resources are migrating with it, and thus the penguins have to migrate. So visually, there is not that much difference that I have noticed, but we are able scientifically to determine that climate change is affecting Antarctica. And of course, Antarctica is much different than the Arctic. The Arctic is really feeling the effects of climate change. And I think you can visually see more of a retreat of ice in the Northern Hemisphere. Jim will probably be talking about that on his trips.
There is one glacier that is a popular tourist visiting site. Between my first trip in 2000 and now, that glacier has retreated 2 kilometers, a little over a mile. So in my own short time of visiting Iceland, I can see dramatic changes.
Wow. All right, so we have time for 2 more questions. And one I'll just briefly address. I won't include this in the 2. We got a question asking about parkas and boot rentals being included, and they are. We do provide all of our travelers with complimentary parka and boot rentals as well. The first question from Lainey is, I'm hoping to do Antarctica myself for my 25th anniversary with my husband. I'm looking for a luxury option for young, adventurous passengers. What is your client base like, and what are the advantages of PONANT over the other options? And Wayne, I don't know if you want me to speak to this and you can chime in, or how would you like to handle this one?
Well, let me just say something briefly about that, and then Lindsay, you can step in with anything that I might miss. But as I mentioned before, I have the opportunity to work in Antarctica as a lecturer for many different cruise lines. I prefer to return with Smithsonian because of the clientele that comes along. And I prefer to go with PONANT because with their French-speaking crew, it's such a luxurious adventure to go there without feeling like it's over the top with luxury. The luxury is very much understated. It's a very comfortable ship, and it's a very accomplished ship in terms of the knowledge of the captain and his officers to take us into places that are rarely visited by human beings. So I would say that this is really a good one. I would say that with Smithsonian, the clientele tends to be very inquisitive and curious and open to the lectures that are provided. That is probably the main reason that I choose to continually work with Smithsonian. And the clientele can be mostly young professionals, say from 50 years of age and over, and we oftentimes see people, parents or grandparents, bringing their teenage kids or their 20-something kids. And that's what I will say. And Lindsay, you can add from that as you like.
Okay. Great. So we do have a minimum age of 8 years old for our expeditions. That would include Antarctica. We have taken children that are younger before. It's really on a case-by-case basis. And like Wayne said, I could not agree more. We are really appealing to the curious traveler. So people that want to not just see a certain area, but learn every aspect of it. In terms of why you should go with PONANT, we have actually sent more people to Antarctica than any other cruise line in the world. 35% of all people that have been to Antarctica on a cruise ship have actually gone with PONANT. So if you want to go with the true leader to Antarctica and the people that know Antarctica better than any other cruise line, PONANT is a great option for that. This is the destination that we have figured out, hands down. We know what we're doing, and in my biased opinion, we're very good at it. So I think would be a great choice for you. So the last question I have is from Peter. Peter asks, a question for Wayne. I'm actually already booked on a different PONANT Antarctica program. It's on the new polar exploration vessel, Le Commando Charcot. This cruise goes deeper south to Peter I Island and also Charcot Island in the Weddell Sea. Should we expect different ice conditions there? And are there any volcanoes in this area that are active?
The short answer to that is yes, you can definitely expect a different ice conditions there, because once you go around the top of the Antarctic Peninsula into the Weddell Sea, there tends to be more tabular icebergs there and more concentration of ice. And it is possible that the ship will have to turn around just depending on how many icebergs are there. But the captains are very creative. They can sail around some fantastically large icebergs to give you any experience. And if you're signed up to go as far south as you can, perhaps even reaching the Antarctic Circle, that's certainly a wonderful thing to aspire to. And I have done that on just a handful of occasions. That is also a great option. Of course, when you have any destination in mind, you have to use a lot of your time resources to make sure that the destination is achieved. And you may cut out some things along the way to get there. I would say go to Antarctica any way you can. It is really something that is extremely rewarding. And increasingly, we're starting to see people showing up in Antarctica on their second or even third cruise down there.
That's great. Well, that is wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Jim and Wayne, for your time. And we will go ahead and conclude this webinar. Thank you very much.
Everybody.
All right.